Before that, it's a privilege and an honor to be moderating this session, and I was really looking forward to it, not as an author or a publisher or as a translator or an editor, but actually as a parent. So we'll come to all these questions later, but just to quickly introduce you to our panel here, Manisha. On extreme left, Manisha Choudhary is an author, editor, translator, and publisher. She is the editorial head of Pratham Books, which is India's largest not-for-profit multilingual children's publisher. Next to Manisha is Preeti Paul. Preeti Paul is the director of Oxford Bookstores. Her latest work, ABC Desi, is a lovely alphabet book with a difference where English alphabets and Indian imagery meet drama and beauty. So we'll talk about that book as well. On my right is Clare. Clare is an award-winning Maltese writer who writes for children as well as for adults. She's an active champion of, I do not know how to pronounce the NGO, but Iniz Jamid, which is committed towards promoting literature in Malta. Clare has been translated into several international languages. And then we have Fiona. Fiona is a publisher. She's been the head of publishing and editor with several publishing houses. And she has several Australian bestsellers to her credit. She will talk about she will give us the publishing perspective to the children's literature. So my first question actually to Manisha, in the context of India, so there is always the language, so there are two languages at least that we are learning or speaking in. One is the language of, which is our mother tongue, language of our memories, language of emotions. And the other is the language of opportunities and aspiration. So there's a difference, there's a disconnect there. So therefore, children are often, and the education system is such that it is always encouraging the children to follow the language of opportunities and aspirations. Do you see a disconnect there? Is it you think that our children are not reading enough in the local language?
If you want the short answer, yes, but I'll give you the long answer. And, you know, we have to contextualize that long answer because we have to understand why is it that they're not reading in the local languages. And we also have to understand that this fundamental disconnect between the language of opportunities and the language of emotions is a created dichotomy, which has been to the detriment of our children in terms of their educational achievements as well as their ability to engage with books at all. And there are several aspects to that. One is of accessibility and availability of books in their mother tongues. The second one is that the educational system is one which kind of responds to the larger social reality around the schools, where the parents say that I want my child to learn the language of opportunity, and that is the hope with which they send their child to school. Having said that, if a wish and a prayer is all that it took to educate everybody, then we would all be highly educated, way more than what we are. We do have to remember that in the primary years, the child is basically moving from the home to an alien environment where she comes with a large vocabulary of her own language. If there is no valorizing of that in the school space, what effectively happens is that she has too many other languages and expectations thrust upon her. And what may happen, and very often does sadly, is that she grows up without proper fluency in the mother tongue. And because there is no foundational skill of fluency, which is the basic building block in which you build all other fluencies and learning abilities, she may pass out of school without any proper language. She may have a functional smattering of her mother tongue, which is sort of the home-based language, the emotion-based language, but there is no knowledge available in that. There is also no opportunity for her to explore further the beauties of her own language, if you like, the play and the fun element of her own language. And the way that she's taught English is quite designed to stifle her self-expression. So in this sort of rather complex but a very real scenario all around us, what is happening very often is that the children are not reading because they don't have the books. There are not enough publishers publishing in those languages because they don't see a market. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg over there. And the fact that she's not able to read in the other language. So she may very well grow up being a potential reader but not reading in any of them properly.
That brings us to the next question, which actually I would like Preeti to answer. Preeti, not only as an author or as a curator of content, but also as a parent. So I feel that responsibility somewhere begins at home. Like we have, as parents, do you feel that we've raised a generation where speaking or reading in our own language was not considered cool enough, has not been considered cool enough? And is there something that we can begin at home as parent when we're reading, and reading especially in our own language? How do you ensure that as not only just a content creator but also as a parent?
So I think I belong to that generation that you're talking about and that you're also talking about. But I'm very determined as a mother to make sure that my kids don't, I have 3 boys, 10 years downwards, and so I'm very determined that my kids don't grow up with that sort of sense that we know a lot of things, but we don't really know them well enough to communicate beyond just conversationally. So I spend some time each day reading to my children before they go to school. So we spend 20 minutes in the morning at 6:45 till 7:05 reading in one language over chai and biscuits. Then they go to school, then they come back and they flip to another language. So in school they do English, Arabic and French. Then they come back and then they do Arabic and French, and then the night again they do Hindi. So they have a very complicated day. But I'm determined that if there's one thing that I'm going to give my children is proper fluency in those 4 languages so that they can write it, they can speak it, they can think it, and they can live it. Because I really feel that if you lose the language, you lose the culture. So I'm determined that my kids will have that. They're going to lose the other 3 languages that I know, which is Punjabi, Sindhi, and Bengali. But I don't think it's possible for me to give them that as well. So I've picked my story for them, and they're not going to have the same life that I have. They have a different story.
So Clare, actually, as you can see, we come from a multilingual setup where in a family we're speaking so many languages, and the context is slightly different. But I would like to understand the context of Malta, where you come from. Do you also grapple with the same kind of conflict or dichotomy that Manisha and Preeti are talking about?
Yes, it's very similar because we know both Maltese and English, and as from kindergarten, so English and Maltese are the national languages, both of them. And as from kinder, in schools, they have to learn both languages up to 16-year-olds. They're compulsory. And at home, parents choose to speak to them mostly in English and Maltese as well. But now, since English is the privileged language, and English, as you're saying, is the language of opportunities, of studying abroad, of working abroad, and Maltese is only spoken in a very tiny country of 400,000 people only. So parents tend to speak to their children only in English. So they go to school, and Maltese is then their second language and not their first language. It depends on the parents. We know friends that decide to talk to the children in both languages. So the father just speaks Maltese, for instance. The mother just speaks English to them. And the child is healthily bilingual, and he switches immediately between 2 languages. With the father, he speaks, for instance, only Maltese, and the mother only English. But it's not so easy to keep this distinction. And especially then, if the parents between themselves are talking English, then the child could easily, take that as the language. Also, but Anisha was saying about the books, for instance. Till very recently, we didn't have nice books in the mother tongue, and because the population is small. The publishers don't want to print a very small print run. There is no profit if you print 500 books or 1,000 books or even 2,000, no? And of course we have all the English books possible in the market, and they're colorful, they're beautiful, they have interesting stories, so they're not very expensive. A Maltese book would be more expensive than a British book. So it's easier now, to grab an English book rather than a Maltese one.
So that actually very organically brings us to the next question to Fiona, which is about do you feel that there's dearth of good, innovative, interesting content in the space of children's literature? And as a publisher, how does one create an innovative solution to that? I know the context will be different, and it's a very generic question that I've asked, but I would like to have your perspective.
Well, I think I sort of come from a background where I've worked in multinationals, and over the last almost 2 years I've been working for a small indie, and one of the things that attracted me to them was that they began really rather than as a traditional publisher, they began really as a philanthropic sort of enterprise. And the guy who actually started it brought the Body Shop to Australia, and of course, as you know, the Body Shop was very involved in the sort of processes of helping the community, and he really wanted to put something back, and he became very interested in hearing about the number of Indigenous children and the literacy level and how bad it was. And so he and our now head of publishing actually started this enterprise where they went out to the communities, Aboriginal communities, remote communities, and the Tiwi communities, and actually started doing books with the kids and getting kids involved in illustrating, writing their own stories, and then eventually translating some of those books into the Tiwi language, which is pretty extraordinary. But on the same token, this was not a profit situation, so it was definitely done as a non-profit. But I think that the learnings that they had from that was just extraordinary, and I think that's now led us into a new sort of place now, because I think looking at that period, and then eventually when they decided to become a literal trade publisher and have to do P&Ls and all those ugly things, is starting to think, how do we bring that into a real children's list, which was only just really started one now, and how do we think about actually getting back into that space and using it in a commercial sense.
I would like Manisha to actually elaborate on that, where you're dealing with problems of P&L, not problems really, but the reality of P&Ls. How do you keep here is a not-for-profit organization. How do you make the model sustainable and keep creating content in so many languages which you want to actually, and you actually make an effort of taking to the ground to the children, and you make sure that they're reading. So how do you keep the model sustainable, both in terms of content creation as well as trade? Not trade really, but commerce. Actually, commerce is a better word.
Well, it's a bit of a hope and a prayer very often, but it's when you talk about sustainability, we do have to look beyond just economic sustainability, although you cannot keep saying that for the rest of your life. At some point, you do have to be cognizant of the economic aspects of making your business at least viable. However, there are certain languages which are dominant or which have larger readerships even in our country. I mean, we have so many languages, which is great at one level, but you really have to sort of stratify how you look at the whole question of language as well as content creation. At the level of stories and finding good content, I find that the really rich content lies with the languages which you don't hear normally. They're not in the dominant languages, because those narratives, whether it's the Mahabharata or whatever, everybody knows about them. The sort of little stories which you don't hear because it's a little language or it's a spoken language, it may not have a script and so on. Those are the stories that are really fresh. And those are the stories that have not been heard before. So in terms of finding content, it's a good strategy to go source the content ground up. Thereafter comes the hard part, where you have to basically put your money where your mouth is and ensure that you're creating from an oral source a publishable book. and also ensure that it's culturally relevant in the different languages, which is not so difficult to do when you're within India, I mean, or at least certain regions of India. But the economics of it is at least presently largely philanthropically funded. And I mean, I do confess that I have the luxury of not always having to worry about the economics of things, because we work with a mission and we say we've got to do this for reasons other than economic. But we are slowly getting to the point where in certain languages our books are selling well enough for us to be able to plow that back. But we also, because we are in a mission mode, we do things like we free up things from copyright. We put them up on Creative Commons. And basically try and build up enough of a groundswell in the larger community saying that, hey, all of you guys out there who like your stories, who like your languages, would you not like the same opportunity to be available to all these new kids who are coming to school for the first time and their families? So lot of language enthusiasts in the smaller languages, because of the internet, are coming on board our digital platform and putting up their own translations and so on. So I think what we are doing is we are basically seeding a much larger market, which may fructify at some point in time. I may not be around to see that, but I think it's important to do. Yeah.
But at least the beginning, it's the beginning.
So I haven't fully answered your question, but that's as best as I can answer it right now.
And if there's anything leading to that, we'll come back to that in the next round of questions. Preeti, that brings me to the next question, because you also run Oxford stores. Do you feel that we've not been able to create very interesting spaces because the libraries are no longer there, the schools, especially the public schools that our children are going to, it has become more of, it has become more about grades and how well you're performing and less about reading. It is more about studying and less about reading. So how do we create interesting spaces? And, I would like you to give example of Oxford. That space where children can come together and there could be sessions where they get to at least listen to their mother tongue or the other languages, the other languages of India. So, for example, are you doing anything in Calcutta? Do you intend doing anything in Delhi?
Yeah. I just want to first take off a little bit from what she said. I actually don't think there's enough in the Indian languages. I mean, I'm going to put my hat on as a bookseller, and I don't think there's enough, and it's not of a high enough quality, either in terms of presentation or in terms of content. And I think sometimes it's a little bit boringly presented for kids. And I don't think that we really know how to edit out what the kid can relate to, or are we trying to impress the kids with so much knowledge and so much information? They just can't take it on. I mean, I try to read to my children the Indian books produced here, and I see that their mind is wandering off somewhere else because they just can't take all of it in. So I think we need to do a lot more in that area, and I think discussing it in a forum like this is a great first step. Because we need to create all that content. I think we need to tell our own stories as well, our own Indian stories, and not try to do an Indian version of something that's been done abroad. So I think the more that comes from deep within us is better. I think the kids nowadays need that original content because it's a confusing world out there full of conflict and confusing things for kids. And I think that these books should be able to help Indian kids understand and decode that world that we're living in. And I think that's a big thing that the books need to do, and we haven't reached that point as yet. We do have a space in each of our bookstores. I mean, I dedicate at least 30% of our sales in the bookstores is books for kids, so that's a large chunk in terms of actual numbers. But physically also we lay out each bookstore so that at least a quarter to 40% is with the kids area, sometimes with the tree, sitting area, carpet, soft spaces. And over the weekends we do workshops and little storytelling. And sometimes we don't just even work with Indian languages, we try to bring some foreign language workshops in, and if the language is difficult to access, then we do dramatized readings or things that they can do with coloring. So there's many ways of accessing the literature if you don't speak the language, and ways to tell the story.
So Preeti talked about the need of creating, need of having interesting content. We don't have interesting. enough interesting content. I would want you to.
Enough,
yeah, you're right in some ways. But as an author, very specifically, if you could tell us what you feel is will entice a child to pick up a book and read it in her language. What are the 5 things that you take care of, or 3 things, or the number of things that you take care of when you're working on a book or creating content specifically for children?
This is very interesting because I do many readings, and at book fairs I'm always there at my publisher's stand to do the readings and see how kids react to my books, especially, and even to others. Sometimes parents choose, or many times, let's say, parents choose the books for the kids. So, and this is really unfair. and I see many kids, picking up a book because so color, for instance, could be one of the things that they like and they would go for. They wouldn't go for a black, dark book like this. But then if they open it and they see cats, then they might like it. But if a parent doesn't like it, then she would tell her kids, no, let's not take this one, let's take this one, because it's pink, and you're a girl, and we should take a pink book. And look, there is a girl on the front cover, and it's for girls, and and so on. I don't really think in numbers now. To come to your question, I don't really think in numbers and on how many things there should. So I write about animals because I know children like animals, but there is much more into them. This is about loss. It's about cats, but it's about loss, and it's about loss of the grandparents, an issue that, yeah. And this is about bird hunting, something that we have on the island. One of you was mentioning reading the culture, in books, when you're reading in the mother tongue, and that's what I try to write, something that they won't find in the English books. So culture is one thing. And then I don't illustrate myself. So that's another thing that I try to at least work with the illustrator as much as I can and see, how attractive we can make the book. But I don't really, have like this, okay, this should go in, this should go in, this should go in. I don't.
But
think
you've pretty much covered everything. I have often heard, Fiona, that producing children's literature, and we've just discussed that as well, is not viable often. How do you make it viable?
Oh, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be a millionaire. But look, I think it's always difficult. I think we can turn ourselves inside out about those things, and I think it's difficult when you're thinking of it has to have these certain ingredients. I think at the end of the day, it still needs to be a book that we know you fall in love with. As a publisher, you fall in love with, you think this is a wonderful story. You see that combination of an illustrator and a writer, and there are very many examples of that in some of the Australian bestsellers and so on. But I think what I find really interesting is we've just been involved with a bookseller that's doing this wonderful charity with kids, which is sort of connected. There is already the Indigenous Literacy Foundation, which does some amazing work with Aboriginal children. But this is also one of the booksellers saying, okay, there's not just those children that are not getting access to books, and that also we're thinking of publishers, of course, how can we sell books? But they were saying that they go out to schools that are remote, where they might be in the middle of the city, but they're really they're not getting books, the kids' literacy is really low. And what they did is they took out books, instead of taking second-hand books, they took their new books and kids' books. And of course, when we looked at the list, I said, how do you pick which one? Actually, they started just taking a whole bunch of books and seeing which ones the kids went straight to, and they were almost inevitably the ones that the publishers didn't pick, or the parents did. So they said that was really great in the sense that they allowed the kids to sort of do their top 10. And for us as publishers, it was fascinating to look at, what do they go for? And it was certainly some of the things that you didn't actually expect. But as to how you make it viable, look, it's the same nightmare as in adult publishing. You still have to, not nightmare, the same challenge. That is, you still have to think about, okay, I've got this fantastic book, or combination of illustrator and writer, and I have a vision for how it has to be published. How do I then sell it across? You have to get it across all those gatekeepers before you can actually get it out into the world. So I think you just have to constantly work at that. You know, how can I sneak around those gatekeepers or convince them? And so that's very much an early process of getting people to see the book, if it's illustrated, to see some very early, you know, images, to get the book in the hands of the influencers. It's always going to be that issue of getting out there. But I think, you know, I've just felt in looking at those books, I said, well, I can't help, but I want to know what you're learning from those kids, because that would be invaluable to us. I mean, yes, of course we would make money out of it, but on the other hand, it's also just great to see what that is, because aren't we always wondering, what does our audience want? And our audience, of course, the parents buy the books for the kids, but, you know, it would be fascinating to have more of that direct influence. And I think one of the really sad things around that, of course, we have shamefully refugee detention centres now in Australia, which, you know, which we're not proud of. And a lot of kids there are born in those detention centres, or they're only a couple of years old. And this guy who goes around them said he was showing a picture book and put it in the little kid's hand. He didn't even know what to do with it. Just had to turn the pages for him. So I think, wow, I think there's, you know, there's a lot of work to be done there. And, you know, I think we all know that kids learning to read, learning to love to read, need to be able to read in their own language, but they need to read. They need to see the joy of storytelling. Anyway.
They need to read, they need to understand the joy of storytelling. But Manisha, do you feel that while we keep discussing this at such academic forums, and we have these very earnest discussions on how to make reading a habit, especially for young children, there's a huge disconnect there at the ground level. Sometimes I feel that we're being presumptuous when we're saying it's really just an urban upper middle class elite, not problem really, but way of thinking that no, but we want only English books, or no, we're not reading. You know, children are not reading their languages at all. So what is the kind of stories that your audience wants? What are the kind of stories that they're looking for? And how do you inculcate the joy of storytelling?
Actually, you don't have to inculcate the joy of storytelling because it's inside all of us. It just needs the right kind of environment to come out. And we need to situate this discussion. I'll connect somewhere back to what Preeti said. And she said that we don't produce good enough children's books in our languages. But there is a reason for that. We have to understand the class dynamics of the numbers of children in our country, and not everybody comes to the urban center to a bookstore. And we are also talking about the element of choice amongst children who've never had the luxury of choice, who are coming to school for the first time. Their libraries may be locked up. Also, the education system militates against giving autonomy to children to choose. Right? So if there is a library period, the child may not be able to choose. The gatekeepers may decide that we will put in the most boring books in the library and ensure that the children will never become readers, right? And also, you know, if I could produce the kind of books that Preeti would be proud to put in her bookstore, I would need a fortune to do that. So I have to somewhere walk a thin line between all of these and say that, you know, there are really good stories out there at the ground level. I can get those stories, put them into book form within my economic constraints, and what I have to ensure is accessibility amongst children. So if I can animate libraries, if I can convince schools that it's important to read beyond the textbook, that is part of my job to do. And, you know, we are doing the outreach for the JLF partly because of that, because we believe that anybody who's walking into an educational institution needs to have an education in the broadest sense of the word. And everybody from my generation believed that that was possible to do because of books. Yeah. You know, it gave us the ability to make our own choices and make us generally more autonomous. If we are denying autonomy simply because we don't create the material conditions where they have good libraries or access to good books or the freedom of choice, and they have teachers who are sort of beating it down their heads that you just mug up your lesson and go take your exam and, you know, you're literate, you know, somewhere we're we're making a mockery of the whole idea of education. So if we need to expand the whole idea of what education means to any school goer, I think books absolutely are a critical part of that in any format, I mean print or digital or whatever, I mean depending on whatever is economically viable. And if you want to continue to produce good books where we need good illustrations and so on, it is capital intensive. But I think, the cultural aspects of that and the larger implications for what kind of citizen are we looking at 20 years from now should, give us pause to say that we do need to invest in this. So, again, I don't know if I've really answered your question, but we do need to situate it amongst all these frameworks and understand why is children's literature important, first in their own language and then in the languages of the world. Yeah.
Very important, and I think this sums up what we're trying to really discuss here. But Preeti, I would like to talk about your book. What made you write the alphabet book, and what was the purpose behind doing a book which talked about alphabets? What is the context that you have created in that book?
Can I just continue with what? So. The bookshop that I represent is an English language bookstore, and it's going to be 100 years next year. And it's supposed to epitomize everything about English language publishing, and we've had generations of the most famous authors visiting. But about 10 years ago, we started in the Calcutta bookstore a Bengali section, which everyone said don't do. Bengali said don't do, and you know how proud Bengalis are of their language. And now it's about 7% of our total sales, and we've actually started a Bengali literature festival last year, and you can't imagine the response it's had. In the Delhi bookstore, we've started an Urdu section and a Hindi section, because I found a lot of people said that they came to me saying that, okay, you'll do the event and we'll have an amazing audience reaction, but then you're not really putting your money where your mouth is by not stocking the books. So we said, okay, we'll take the books first, and then we'll do the events. I'm happy to say we're on our 24th Urdu program. So we've been running this program for 2 years now, because a lot of people said Urdu is a dying language, it's been Islamified, and many other problems with that. And now the Hindi program has taken off. So we're trying to do it in the bookstores. The books actually don't cost very much. So they're very accessible to everyone from a price point of view. It's just that the content and the production needs to be improved or expanded, I would say.
Which needs investment, and it is another, which requires another round of discussion. Yeah. But let's talk about your book.
Okay, so the ABC children's book, which I'm going to unveil a little bit later tonight. My children started learning English at a relatively late age of 6 or 7, and while I was going through books with them and teaching them the alphabet, I realized that Indian kids in India were learning the alphabet with the very same books that we had used maybe 30 years before. And my mother's generation had used 50 years before. So there's been generations of Indian kids growing up learning English with the very same books.
Ren and Martin, to be precise.
Yeah, and Peter and Jane went up the hill. And so you'll have C for cottage, which will be the English thatched cottage sitting somewhere, or P for panda, or R for English rose. And I said that I felt that we're living in such a make in India moment. Why don't we have, and English is now very much part of our story as well. So how come we don't have books that celebrate all the things that Indian kids see around them, like peacocks and parrots and tigers and yoga and tiffin boxes and things that are part of all our collective memory of growing up in India, and things that we can identify. Producing this book, and then I was trying to find an imagery that would be rooted in our own culture, and I felt that the best people to work with were these Bollywood hoarding artists, which have been painting all these amazing hoardings all around India. That whole genre of painting is going to disappear very fast, because we now have digital painting technologies, and electronic ways of producing these images. So that whole vocabulary is going to disappear in the next literally few years. And so I started working with the Bollywood hoarding artists to create the images and objects of the pages, and as a result of which, ABC Desi has been born. It's full of things that we see around us. It's part of our collective memory. It's very much celebrating the English language with Desi imagery, and it's living a Make in India moment.
So there you have English language with the context which from where you are coming. That brings us, so obviously how you create the content is very important, and how you read the content to the child is very important. Clare, is there anything that you would like to read or talk about, because you hold a lot of reading session with the children, so is there a specific way or some magic that you do on children when you're reading to them? What keeps them intrigued? What keeps them happy?
The voice. No, I don't have kids myself, so I don't do readings at 7 a.m. or quarter to 7, 6:45, pretty, till 7:05. But yes, I do many readings in school, and Fiona mentioned the hard work, and this is the hard work of the author, and this is how the books get sold, because if they stay on the bookshelves only, it's difficult to be in the hands of the children. So with readings and with this magical kind of reading that you were mentioning in the classroom, this is usually then how the books get sold, and then they want even the signature, and they want to read it again then with their parents at home, and ultimately on their own.
They also dream of becoming an author. They also want, yes.
Yes. In fact, it's true. One of the questions when I ask what you want to become when you grow up, after a reading session, probably most of them would want to be an author or an illustrator. I think one of the most important things is silence. So the first thing that there should be silence in the classroom. I usually read in classrooms of 25 to 30. That's the number that we have in classrooms in Malta. Secondly, if it's in a library, if the environment is books around, and if it's a comfortable environment, that also helps in the reading. And then I just read normally. Quietly, peacefully.
You don't do all the voices?
Would you?
No, not really. I'm not an actor, so I don't do the voices. I don't do dramatized reading. It's usually a very quiet and simple reading. I'm usually sitting, and the kids are all in front of me, many times on cushions, and most of the times in a library or in the classroom library. They usually don't have the book, so it's just one book that they see. Sometimes I show the picture, sometimes I don't. And after they would want to see the pictures as well. Yeah, that's it.
But that's pretty much an environment which is privileged, which is comfortable, which is secure, which in some way or the other very naturally nurtures the habit of reading or the joy of reading. But you talked about spaces where reading is unthinkable. It's not, that.
Like
so
refugee
camps. How do you reach out to an audience like that? What is it that you would like to do to keep them engaged in the as a part of the sessions that you're holding, or make them potential readers? Apart from the fact that of course there's literacy and all of that, but just as engaged audience, because I see that as a very challenging space, and in fact that's one question that I will take to Manisha also, that how do you reach out to those spaces where while there's joy of storytelling, there's no literacy, or there's no even the basic right of reading or writing or education?
Well, I think well, for a start, you have to have commitment from people within the industry to do that. There's a certain amount of that, but I think some people are doing some extraordinary work, and I think in terms of getting out to some of those communities, I think one of the things that the ILF is doing really well is actually getting in with the kids and actually getting them to write and to tell stories themselves, and to get some of the, certainly in the Aboriginal communities, getting some of the elders involved, because they have the stories, they have the legends and so on. And a lot of that has been lost over the years, and I think there's a lot of the Aboriginal elders particularly who have come back and said we want to get the kids back on the path, the ones that have been lost in the between, because of course we've had the whole lost generation where children were taken away from their parents because it was considered they would be better off with white parents. So that's a whole generation that's affected all of those kids and so on. So this next generation is sort of like, I think while the elders are still there trying to recreate that and get that storytelling going as well. But I think with kids as well, it's just that the storytelling is everything, you know, and getting them involved and actually feeling that people care, you know. I think that's the big thing.
People care, that's the big thing, yes, the most important thing. So last round of just summing up, we've talked about challenges, we've talked about the realities, we've talked about how to make the content interesting. So the last thought, Manisha, which keeps you motivated in the space that you are in?
That's a pretty easy one, actually. If you just come to one of my outreach sessions where one of the storytellers is telling a story in a dusty school somewhere, and you see the children completely absorbed and then wanting to touch the book which she was holding up, it's very easy to stay motivated. The good thing about working with children is that you just have to be simple and kind of stay the course. And the rest of it just happens on its own, because it's largely the adults who have the anxieties, not the children. And if you even create a 1 hour of a space for 1 hour which is non-restrictive, you find that the children are quite willing to come and talk and, you know, come and sit in your lap and, you know, sort of talk to you about just about anything and have the most wonderful disconnected conversations which actually connect up in some strange way. So you just have to be, you know, it's not difficult to stay motivated when you work with children, simply because the input and the output is almost immediate. You don't have to sort of wait for years to see, oh, did he grow up to be Gandhi or not? If you made her happy for the 1 hour that you worked with her, I think that's a good enough motivator, at least for me.
Also, if they like the sounds, you know, the rhyme, anything, I mean, it can keep them motivating as such. But sounds and rhymes especially, and even sometimes, you know, like difficult, bombastic words could make them motivating enough to make them listen, and yeah.
So can I ask you the last question? What keeps you happy, writing for children or writing for adults? Or happier, rather?
For children, because children give you their immediate feedback. Adults are difficult. So children, you know, tell you immediately even if they don't say anything, you can know from their eyes if they enjoyed the story or not, if it's absorbed them or not. No, I just love reading for kids.
So here we have an audience which is responsive, which is simple, which is just so delightful, and yet as we talked, there are so many dots that need to be connected. So as curator of content, as a content creator, and as a parent, your last thoughts on how to motivate our children and create spaces where reading in local languages, or mother tongue, it stays intact and is a priority.
To be truthful, I actually feel that people do want to buy books and they do want to read in the mother tongue. And I actually feel that there's just not enough out there that's interesting, that's vibrant, that connects. So I mean, I'm searching as a mother every day, as a bookstore owner every day, what else we can put into the bookstores that people want to read. And every time we introduce, you know, publishers like Katha or Tulika or Tara, we just totally sell out. And then people come back and say, give us more and give us, and there's just not enough out there. So I actually don't feel that people don't want to read in their mother tongue. I feel now we've reached a point where there's been enough discourse and dialogue and people want to do it. They just needs to be more great stuff out there. And I think people all of you are working in that area, and I think the more you get out there, the better for all of us.
Fiona, your last thoughts on being able to create interesting content for children, and what would you do if you had to fill that space, you know, the space that you see, the gap that is there?
Well, I think we'd all would like to think that we create beautiful, interesting books, but I think that, you know, it's always that, as I was talking about gatekeepers, it's not just laying blame or anything, but like we're all aching to get more books out there, and certainly in any form, really, for kids and things that we love to publish. And I think that it's that nexus in between where within publishing houses or in terms of that, you still have to get through and sort of say, look, this is a great book, we're going to sell it. And then again to get, well, the bookseller's not going to like that. You know, so I think it's almost like there needs to be more of a direct, at the end of the day, in every sort of publishing, more of a direct conversation between the creators of content and actually the people who want it, you know, and what they want. Because I think sometimes that water just gets muddied in the middle of you know, well, I've got this great book, I really want to sell it, you know, it's almost like, you know, but in the middle of that, there's people going, well, I don't know, we did a book like that and it didn't really work, or nobody wants to read books in that language, you know, so, but is that true? You've already proved it's not. So, you know, that's just that, where we hit that wall in the between it, just like to break through it, that's what we need to do. We need a revolution, really.
And I do hope that this discussion that we had is one step towards having that revolution, towards, you know, breaking that wall. It has been a great discussion, and really I have run short of questions because most of my questions have been answered. I will be very honest. So therefore, I hope if there is anything that you would like to ask from the panelists here, please feel free. As parents, as content creators, you want a publisher, we have a publisher here. You want a mother, we have mothers here. We have storytellers here. We have people who will buy your books. So there you go. We have the right panel. Questions from the audience, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Mita Wiker from People's Archive of Rural India. I wanted to know, we spoke about storytelling, and I assume most of it was about fiction. So I just wanted to know, especially from Manisha, when you work in the outreach programs, whether you also read stories that are non-fiction for children in Indian languages.
Thank you. That's a very important question.
Yes, we absolutely do. When we are looking at content creation for children and particularly for first generation schoolgoers, we absolutely have to look at non-fiction and do interesting non-fiction in the Indian languages, and we make it a point that our list has a balance between the two. It may be presented in a fictional format or not, really depending on the level of the book, but it is very much part of our endeavor that we create good non-fiction in Indian languages as well, because we don't actually have a tradition of non-fiction for children in our languages.
Anybody else would like to add to that? Non-fiction on non-fiction, Clare?
Oh. Actually, I was saying we have the same problem. We don't have a lot of non-fiction books in Maltese, in English, of course. That's the case, but not in Maltese. And I don't write non-fiction myself.
Hi. As a bookseller, my interest is always in looking for stories from our regions. My question would go to Manisha. If you're looking for more stories from the northeast of India.
I couldn't agree more.
Hi. I have a question in terms of mother tongue publishing. Like, is there a way that you sort of go about collecting books, like thinking I need to start with like early grade reading and sort of build it up, or do you just take the stories as they come, or how do you plan that?
We publish books at 4 levels, with level 1 being the simplest, and we don't really grade them according to age or grade, but we base them on assumed reading proficiency in a particular language. So when we accept stories for the year, we basically ensure that we have a healthy mix between all of them. But because there is a greater need in the picture book category, the simplest books in Indian languages are what is where the biggest gap is. Our list tends to have more books for younger children than older children, purely because we believe that it's somewhat easier to write for older children. I'm sticking my neck out a bit when I say that. But Lots of other publishers will be in the space where they may be publishing for older children, but because it's capital intensive to do good picture books, not enough people are publishing simple picture books in the Indian languages. So we tend to have more of that, but we do accept according to having a bit of everything.
Hello, my name's Wendy. I'm from Australia. I'm an unpublished children's author. I really just wanted to make a comment, and I found this discussion very interesting because I write my children's stories for Indonesian children. But I've actually been doing a bit of informal research with children's librarians in Victoria, in Melbourne, and I know you've been using the word interesting, but the word that children's judges of children's books use is fun. So in Australia, yeah, that's what they see as an important ingredient, not just interesting, but fun. So that children can actually play around. Sometimes the books can have a bit of a naughty subject matter, which perhaps parents and teachers may not approve of, but these are often the ones that are fun for the children. Just wanted to make that comment, thank you. Perhaps there's some feedback from the speakers about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Actually, you know, I just realized that here, at least for in case of, so in my case where my children are now 10 and they're reading, they're really driven by the peer pressure. So what their friends in classroom are reading, they're coming back and they want to read that. Whatever is the fad or the trend. So therefore, if a Geronimo Stilton, for example, is a fad, then you know the children will want to read it. And they pick up a lot of their book list from the other children that they're interacting with. So the point is that how are we introducing interesting new books to them? So which is where in fact I should have commented then, but the fact is that children are also just as a parent I can't decide for them. They are the ones who are actually choosing their books, which is great. But in the process of doing that, they are completely rejecting sometimes. They're completely rejecting what could be new or fun or naughty, because there's this little time, so they're picking up what. So at least in the case of older children, that is what is happening, and this I speak purely from my experience, and this is not really like an expert comment. This is something that has come to me. So I'm speaking from my experience. Any other question? Thank you so much. Just one last question.
My question's for Clare, because you write for children, and you mentioned how you don't appreciate parents directing children to books that are that pertain to or abide with gender stereotypes. So when you're writing for children, do you ensure that these stereotypes are kept away, and do you try to make it more gender neutral, if, for the lack of a better word?
Yes, I do, and I must say I don't write fun books, so my topics are always about.
I write black books books with black covers. Is it?
Yeah, books with very, very dark, as you can see, and very dark illustrations as well. But still, children like them, and yes, I do avoid as much as I can stereotypes. Also because I think we have a lot of them already, so we don't really need them anymore. And I'm not the one who's going to write that kind of stories. But to maybe to comment a little bit on the fun books. Of course, I also like fun books. I choose not to write fun books, one, because there are many fun and naughty books for children, and they have plenty from where to choose. And also, a book about loss, for instance. Since I don't have kids, but I have nephews, this came about last summer when my nephew asked me a question: what happens if my mama dies, and even if my grandma dies? Can I come and live with you? And then after this question, which kept, like haunting me, many of my friends were telling me, well, yes, children, speak about death, what happens if you die, who will take care of us, what happens if grandparents die. And we don't really know, some of our friends were telling me, I don't really know what to say to my kids, you know, about this topic. And we don't have books in our language about this topic. So that's how it came about. And when it came out, many parents were telling me this is, you know, a good way to at least start the topic about loss, about grandparents not coming back. And, well, where do they go from here? What happens next?
Yeah, so which means, yeah, there'll be fun books and there'll be dark books. There'll be books of
thought-provoking, maybe.
Thought-provoking. There'll be books which will be real, and there'll be books which will be surreal. There'll be books which will, but I hope there are many more books and there's more content that this has been our constant worry, that there's not enough interesting content. I hope there's more innovative content and it reaches the readers, it reaches our young readers. But first, let's just begin with ourselves, and let's just pick up books in our languages, our mother tongues. Unless we keep a lot of books in our mother tongue at home, our children will not start reading them. And if they don't read, who will we write for? So I hope that's a thought that we all take back from here. Let's just pick up books in our local languages and let's start reading first ourselves and then force our children to read them. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience and this has been a wonderful panel.